if I may, probably my favorite case, well, I've got many, but is Yogi Narus, who, as far as I know, is still living, a gentleman in Japan who teaches meditation and psychic ability and so forth. He began levitating at a very early age, displaying a number of these so-called cities, and allowed himself to be photographed on 7 separate occasions.
Welcome. I'm here again with Preston Dennett. Preston, welcome back.
Thanks. Always great to be here.
All right. So we were just talking before this, and a subscriber had asked that you come on to talk about levitation. And then I don't remember if it was from a private conversation or if it was from a recorded conversation, but it doesn't matter. There's no secrets here. But you had mentioned that you'd be interested at some point in talking about levitation. So that subscriber kind of triggered that memory. I'm like, oh yeah. And it sounds like people want to hear about it. So, and I want to hear about it too. So I reached out to you again, and thank you for saying yes.
Hey, thanks to the subscriber. I never get enough opportunities to talk about this subject. I really find it super interesting. I think there's a lot people aren't aware of with human levitation. And I mean, the evidence is overwhelming. It's been scientifically proven. There's cases in every culture. It goes back thousands of years. There's a lot to it.
And you have a book on it, right?
That's right. Human Levitation. As far as I know, it's the most comprehensive book on this subject.
And when did you release it? I want to say it's pretty...
Gosh, it was probably, some years ago, 5, 10.
Okay.
Probably closer to 10 years ago.
Okay. All right, well, let's start from the very bottom of all this. Can you define what levitation is?
Yeah, there are different types of levitation. There's something called stick levitation, where, yogis will hold on a stick and they float up, or finger levitation, that game that kids play, where, light as a feather, stiff as a board, and essentially you can lift a person up or reduce their weight. And I think there's some validity to both of these, but what I'm talking about, human levitation, is levitating without any external device. So basically floating up in the sky, and, the term flying is a little bit dramatic, but essentially that's what's going on here. I think it is probably related to out-of-body experiences. That's what my research certainly shows. But in these cases, people are physically levitating off the ground, reducing their weight in some way. There's different ways to explain it or look at it. Each culture kind of has their own interpretation of it. But yeah, it's amazingly well verified.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So you mentioned there are different types of levitation. Can you go into a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, this is something I kind of did myself because the literature on this is a little bit all over the place. And with 300, 400 recorded cases, I started trying to categorize them into, different areas. And it worked pretty well. Because while I think there's probably a little qualitative difference between these different types, there definitely is some real differences here. And the first category I call ecstatic levitation, because this mostly comes from saints throughout history who, through years of prayer or asceticism or just focusing on God or the idea of God, fall into an ecstatic trance and levitate anywhere from a couple of inches off the ground to, feet off the ground. And this is mostly present, of course, in monks and nuns and holy people of all cultures. So that's one really prominent category, probably the most common. But really, right next to that is what I would call meditative levitation, with the only real difference is this is more in the Eastern cultures, and it's they consider levitation a talent that each of us have that you can intentionally cultivate. See, with ecstatic levitation, it's a spontaneous thing. It happens. They're not looking for it, but the Eastern cultures have methods you can actually use to achieve this as a innate human, I don't want to call it a supernatural ability. I think it's natural, but it's one of what they call the siddhis, Siddhes, related to a number of different manifestations of, quote, superhuman abilities like invisibility or immunity to fire or superhuman strength, these sort of things.
By the way, when I interviewed Dr. Dean Radin about, some of this stuff, because he's done empirical research on all sorts of psychic phenomena, the one thing he did say is in the Eastern tradition, people are taught about siddhis when they start to meditate and things like that. They're like detours on the path to enlightenment, in a sense. So it starts with synchronicities, premonitions, animal communication, all sorts of stuff. So people in the Eastern traditions, when these things start to happen spontaneously, they're not surprised. In the Western tradition, when people start meditating and they start having synchronicities and premonitions, and they get kind of freaked out and sometimes they get distracted. But he did comment on exactly what you're talking about, the concept of siddhis.
Not supposed to be a goal to try to achieve these things. They are considered obstacles, and you shouldn't become too focused on them.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, I mean, in some of these cultures, they've got specific techniques just to do it. So another one is called mediumistic levitation. And this turns up in many, many, quote, haunting cases.
Like possessions, too. Possession cases.
And so people find themselves, being pulled up to the roof or what have you. And in these cases, it is a little different because this is interpreted as an outside force acting on the human organism as opposed to you doing it personally. This might be more considered uncontrolled physical mediumship, perhaps, because I'm not sure there is a real difference here, but it does seem to be two major things going on here. People who are doing it themselves and other people who are basically elevated by spirit influence. And that's mediumistic levitation. It's very common. And again, accounts go way, way back. And there's another category that I find super interesting, which I call crisis levitations. And this happens when people perhaps have a bad fever, food poisoning, fall off a cliff. A good example is Robert Monroe of Out of Body fame, who was walking down the steps and stepped on his shoelace and tripped down the stairs. And he says he floated slowly to the ground. And it happened to him again. He slipped on icy steps and again, he said floated slowly to the ground. There was a case in, I forget where this was, Europe, I think, where a bunch of prisoners got botulism and were very sick. And they started recording that they had less weight than normally. All kinds of poltergeist activity was going on. But there's a number of cases in the literature where people have falls and they float down, or an illness perhaps. So this is what I call crisis levitation. It's probably one of the rarest categories. Another, this is super interesting, is running levitation. And this is present in each culture. The Tibetans call it Longum Pa. This is a technique they use where they can cover vast distances. I think it's probably related to teleportation to some extent. But there are many, many accounts of this. In the Native American culture, there was a case where this gentleman, a Native American, was traveling with these other Americans, Europeans essentially. I think they were going from one state towards Texas, and he ran ahead of them. And so they followed his footsteps and they saw them becoming wider and wider and wider. And then they disappeared. So they traveled as fast as they could to the destination. They found him there. And they verified that he had been there for like 2-3 days. He got there pretty much instantly. That's running, the Indian running, it's called in the Native American culture. So yeah, this is present in many cultures. I interviewed one lady firsthand, a friend of a friend who had levitation experiences. And she says, I don't know if this is related, but when I was a kid, I could outrun anyone in my neighborhood, faster than all the boys. And this kind of rang a bell for me. And she's like, I don't know how to describe this, but it was almost like I was running on the tips of my toes. So maybe she was beginning to touch on that, but that's called running levitation. Here's another super rare category, which is probably more common than is reported because the percipient, the person who's having it, is asleep. Essentially, people look over at their partner or whoever, their child, and they're hovering above the bed, 2-3 feet above the bed, fast asleep. A number of cases of this. And this just points towards mechanics behind levitation, which is almost always involved with some type of dissociation. Paranormal researchers have long known that dissociation is the gateway towards paranormal phenomena, whether you're sleeping and you have precognitive dreams, or using a Ouija board as a form of dissociation, slight. But meditation, of course, prayer, all of this, it's all connected to dissociation. And the last one I just call spontaneous levitation, because it occurs with no discernible cause. Someone can just suddenly float up. This happens most often to children, actually. There's this, I call it the floating stage. I did not get that term, actually. I read it in a book on children who have paranormal experiences. I think it was Cassandra Eason, who interviewed several children who had levitation events. And this is how I got involved in this subject, because a family friend, Mary Frank, I'm always asking everyone, have you seen a UFO? And I kind of opened it up to have you had any paranormal experience, anything unexplained? And she's like, oh yeah, when I was 7 years old, I levitated. And I kind of gave her the side eye. I'm like, Mary, really? She's like, listen, no one believes me, but I'm telling you the God's honest truth. And what she said was that she was going to visit the doctor with her parents and went running. This was a U-shaped corridor. They had to go all the way to the end. She turns around the corner and she says, suddenly there was an aura around her, and she found herself lifted up off her feet. She first thought someone might be behind her, but she turned around, no one was there, and she floated at kind of a 45-degree angle all the way down the corridor, turned the corner, went all the way to the end, and was set gently on her feet. And she went running back, of course, and told her parents, who thought she was crazy, never was able to reproduce the experience. That was what got me interested in this, because I could see she was telling the truth. She was very emotional about it, very passionate, really sincere. So that's when I started asking everyone I knew, have you had an experience? And I finally found a couple. I've interviewed 10 people who've had this experience firsthand. So I did find quite a few cases, children floating up and down stairs, or, it's over sidewalks and things like this. And it generally manifests between age 5 to 7 to, up to 10, 11, 12, and then stops. But it's definitely a category that, is hard to explain in the same way as all the others. So those are the 7 categories. And again, essentially the same thing going on here, I think, except for perhaps mediumistic levitation. But as far as I can tell, this is an ability we all have, every one of us, that can be manifested through prayer, meditation, or intentional, pranayama is a method that the Eastern cultures use. And this appears in African cultures all over the world.
How many cases have you uncovered on this?
Initially, in the book, there's some 330 cases, and over half of those are what we would call saints or holy. Well, pretty much all the people who have levitated have that kind of bent. They're, very deeply spiritual, or perhaps a nun or a monk. Remember the flying nun, that show? I kind of thought back, I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, some 300 plus cases. Now it's probably closer to 500, because I still get contacted by people like, oh, I had that experience when I was a kid. Usually that's what they'll tell me. I asked Dolly Safran, who she's the subject of my book, Symmetry, have you ever levitated? And she had a number of incidents, mostly as a child, but a few as a young adult. And I keep hearing more cases, several from contactees, actually. I did a whole chapter in one of my books because contactees are usually profoundly psychic. And a number of them, including Whitley Strieber, by the way, have experienced this. Jacques Vallée had a case, Bud Hopkins, a number of people who researched UFO contactees have run across this. Stephen Greer, for example, claimed to have levitated twice.
Is there any scientific basis behind these events?
Yeah, it's been proven in a scientific laboratory setting, to some degrees, probably a half dozen times. And some cases, of course, are better verified than others. One of my favorite experiments was done by Hereward Carrington, a scientist who was very interested in the paranormal. And he decided to test finger levitation, the childhood game.
Light as a feather, right?
Yeah. But he was very clever, and I really want someone to repeat this experiment, because as far as I know, no one has. But what he did is he got 5 people together and put them on chairs and a table on a very large scale. And it weighed, I don't know, whatever it was, 700 pounds or so. And then had them do rhythmic breathing for a few minutes and took one person in the chair and lifted them up. And the first time he did that, he recorded a loss of weight of 57 pounds. Did it again, it was 60. Did it again, it was like 49. And ultimately, it was always somewhere between 50 and 60 pounds after, he did it 10, 20 times. But it's not been repeated, so take that for what it is. But probably one of the best scientific studies was with the medium Eusapia Palladino, who basically became Europe's most studied medium and traveled Europe, convincing scientist after scientist after scientist, levitating. Very well verified. Unfortunately, she was caught cheating or hoaxing later in life, which kind of sullied it a little bit. But still, many people saw her do this. Very reputable scientists, Dr. Richet, Hereward Carrington, many of them. Another, Carmine Mirabelli, Brazil's most famous medium by far, was visited by a group of, I think it was 10 scientists from L'École Polytechnique and others. And they tied him up with chains and stuff. He levitated in full view, disappeared, and they found him in another room. He could speak 40 languages, some which were dead languages, what we consider dead languages. Could create apparitions. The stuff this guy produced was very hard for people to explain. But he did it in full view of these scientists. Each one who testified, they could not explain it. A lot of people who worked with mediums have had remarkable evidence. There was another guy who worked with the 2 young mediums, Willie and Rudy Schneider, and they could only levitate in pretty much full darkness. So that's hard to verify, but they ended up stitching phosphorescent pins in their clothes so they could see them, and basically did it over and over again. Unfortunately, once they grew into adults, they were only doing this when they were adolescents. That ability left them once they grew up.
Was that because they just got heavier, or is it just something to do with the youth?
I think it's something to do with youth, because what we see with poltergeist-like activity, which does involve levitation, is almost always involving an adolescent who's perhaps in some way emotionally upset or disturbed. Again, it's probably connected to uncontrolled mediumship. But yeah, there's some really, really good evidence of this. For example, probably the best verified case is Daniel Douglas Hume, a medium from, the late 1800s, from the United States, began having, mediumistic phenomena from a very early age, objects moving around him and all kinds of stuff, but was holding a seance when he spontaneously levitated. He wasn't even aware of it. One of the people there, like, Mr. Hume, do you realize you're floating 3 inches above your chair? He was surprised as the rest of them, but he ended up having 200 or 300 recorded levitations. He traveled the world and did it in front of heads of state, heads of business, literature, Mark Twain, and was very much studied by, I think, Sir William Crookes, inventor of the blowtorch, and other scientists. Often could only levitate in very low light levels, but that's not always the case. He did it in full view of people. I mean, there's case after case after case. In Iceland, there was a medium, Indridi Indridason, who convinced all the scientists in his country. He became Iceland's most famous medium as well. So probably if they were born 100 years or earlier, they would be considered, saints or possessed by the devil, because that did happen as well.
Right. It's amazing how the Catholic Church has just put you in one category or the other, right?
But some really, really well-verified cases. I mean, there was...
How has society reacted to some of these things?
Not great. If you happen to be in church, or a priest, or a father or whatever, a monk, you had a much better chance of this being well accepted. But some people who, spontaneously levitated, it did not go well for them. There was this whole witchcraft craze that, swept through Europe and even into the United States. And there were people who experienced levitation who, were basically accused of witchcraft. So there's a fine line between saint and sinner here, and how people interpret it.
Again, going back to Dr. Dean Radin, he looked at whether or not there was a genetic basis for psychic ability. And what he found is that it's almost like throughout the world, it was basically ubiquitous except for one area. And that was exactly what you said, kind of the countries that were in the Holy Roman Empire. And the reason is because they were basically, anybody with any shred of ability was executed.
Yeah, there's some good evidence that there is a genetic component here, but it's not super prominent. I mean, there was the royal family of Hungary who produced at least 5 members of their family who reported levitations. Joseph Weed was a guy who studied abilities and the paranormal back in the early 1900s, I think. And he went to a street fair once where he met a lady who could reduce her weight by about 1/3 or half. And he absolutely verified it, was convinced. And he asked her, "How do you do this?" She said, "I really couldn't tell you. All I do is I concentrate and I feel light." Here, tapping her chest. And she says, "I'm not sure how this happens, but my father could do it too." And there are a few cases in the literature like this, where apparently, this ability, like psychic ability, like mediumship, there's clearly some genetic component there, because people who are profoundly psychic, often their parents report it as well. So, but, certainly not appearing in every case. I'd say the biggest real connection here is, like I said, dissociation, and people who spend a lot of time trying to develop themselves psychically or in prayer or meditation.
Are there any particular types of individuals who tend to have this ability?
I can tell you it manifests in all kinds of people. There was a guy who was just a farmer in Russia who, had crowds of people coming to him. And he says, I don't know why I can do this. He says, I just do it by sheer willpower. And he would float in the air a foot or two above. And of course, children, there's a lot of cases of that. If you go through the various types, you can see that there's some commonalities here. But definitely it's people who have, a spiritual sort of outlook on life. Even ones who are just, because there's housewives and there's businessmen, there's children, there's It's across the board. But if you dig deep into the cases, almost all of them have that kind of, a belief in spirit, in life after death, and these kinds of, the psychic abilities. But it's hard to say for sure. I think, as near as I can tell, anybody can do this. And according to some sources, it's one of the easier psychic skills to learn. I've tried it. Mind you, I've meditated and I never was able to do it. I can certainly do it when I'm astral projecting, when you're out of body. Everyone's had flying dreams. It's absolutely connected to that. And I would say, gosh, what's the name of this saint? His name is escaping me, but he's considered India's yogi saint. At any rate, his is the earliest first-person account of levitating. And Milarepa, that's it. And he began meditating at a very early age and doing asceticism, going into a cave, eating very little food, not wearing much clothes, and just going crazy off the deep end of deprivation, which is a pathway towards this. And the people who do this always say, don't do that. You don't need to. But of course they did it and it worked for them. So that's kind of interesting to me. At any rate, he said this manifested first in my dream state. And he was flying all the time. And then one day it just manifested in the waking state. And he was seen by many, many people flying over the countryside. He eventually headed for the hills and, isolated himself because it was creating so much attention. But his is the first person account of what it's like to levitate and how it happened. But now there's many, many accounts like this. I talked to Marilyn Hughes, who's still living. She's very well known for her out-of-body books. And I've interviewed her a number of times. And she levitated 2 or 3 times spontaneously. She wasn't looking for it. She says it just happened. In her interpretation, the spirits were helping her to do this. I'm kind of, I don't know. This is something I'm wondering about because most of the cases seem to be internally generated. Mm-hmm. But it was really interesting to hear, people talking firsthand. One lady I interviewed in Colorado said, yeah, it happened to me. I was just meditating one day, and then I opened my eyes, looked down, and I was 4 inches off the floor. She went plunk right down. So it's definitely connected to meditation and I think out-of-body experiences as well. There was another very famous out-of-body guy. He wrote under a pseudonym Yram. We now know his real name. I forget what it is, but he wrote a book. And after one of his astral projection experiences, and he had many, he levitated spontaneously while stepping off of a train. Says it nearly caused him to fall over because it was totally unexpected. But it's clear to me that it is related to that. If I may, probably my favorite case, well, I've got many, but is Yogi Narus, who, as far as I know, is still living, a gentleman in Japan who teaches meditation and psychic ability and so forth. He began levitating at a very early age, displaying a number of these so-called cities, and allowed himself to be photographed on 7 separate occasions. And I've got photographs in my book. I can send them to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
They're pretty impressive because it shows him, because some people look like they're just jumping off the ground. But he's there in his cross-legged posture, some 4 or 5 feet above the ground. And there's a video of him on YouTube somewhere. It took me a long time to find it, where he's describing some of his experiences. But he said, this is the last time I'm going to allow myself to be photographed. I'm not a monkey. This is, I've done this enough to prove to anybody. And this is kind of one of the problems. You can prove it to one person, but then the next one comes along and they're like, well, levitate for me. Back in India, there was a number of people who get together, yogis, and would regularly levitate during ceremonies. They said, to display the glory of God. But most people who have this ability are very quiet about it. St. Teresa of Avila, one of the best verified cases. Numerous people saw her levitating. She hated it. She says she did not like the attention it was drawing towards her. Mind you, this is like the 1500s, so it's quite far back, but very well testified. She wrote about it as well. She had a lot of out-of-body experiences, and then had at least 7 very public levitations, and probably a good deal private ones. But would always get really angry at people who's talked about it and forbade them from talking about it, which nevertheless they did anyway, because this is something that's so spectacular that people absolutely lose their minds. Like St. Joseph of Cupertino, another, probably one of the best cases out there, certainly top 10. He was called the Flying Friar of Europe. And again, Middle Ages, but he attracted thousands of people who would follow him everywhere. The church basically locked him up in seclusion for years. Didn't work. They found him. He levitated from a very young age. He was always just really enamored by the idea of, God and all of this, but had a tough life. His father sold all the furniture. He had a club foot. He's very clumsy, not well educated. Ended up, by sheer synchronicity and amazing luck, getting accepted by a group of Franciscans, I think, and was seen levitating again and again and again. Whenever he would see a little lamb or a cross or anything remotely holy, would set him into what he called one of his fits, and he'd cry out and fly across the room. He converted a whole lot of people from one religion to another, was viewed by a lot of very high-standing people, displayed immunity to fire, going over the candles in various pews and stuff and not getting burned. One time he saw a group of people struggling with a 20-foot wooden cross, trying to erect it, and he let out his customary cry, flew over and lifted it up as if it was, a feather, and placed it in the hole. Daniel Douglas Home did that as well, lifted up a very heavy log. St. Gerard of Magella, one of my favorite guys, because he did anything. I mean, this guy could do anything when he was in that state. There was a ship foundering offshore of, I think, Italy, Spain, and it was a storm, and he saw it and suddenly just floated up to it, put his hand on it, and drew it towards the shore to where people could get off. And people ran up to him like, "How did you do that?" And he said, "When I'm in that state, anything is possible." So, there's so many cases of this. Raja Lakshmi, I think she's still living today. She began levitating as a young girl. And I think this was India, one of the Eastern countries at any rate. She was just a little girl levitating over and over again. Everyone in the village would come and just stare at her through the window. Her parents had to put up little fences and say, "Okay, you can watch from this hour to this hour, but we need our privacy." And they asked her how she did it. And she said, "Well, it all happened when I read the Gospels of Sri Yaktiswar." I ended up buying the book because I'm like, well, and it's this massive book, a biography about one of these guys who was a reported levitator. And it's a fairly clunky book filled with very deep philosophical, his experiences, but interesting. Certainly interesting to me. I read it. I did not levitate, but I was really inspired. But yeah, they've got a photograph of her. I can send that to you. It's not super impressive, but she's a couple of inches off the ground, and her hair is she's different from most yogis. She paints her nails. She wears pretty dresses. She drives a fancy car, but started a whole school, taught all kinds of people, healed someone of diabetes. A lot of these people are, reported to have wild birds land on them and tame wild beasts, or what do you call it? Reproduction of food. There's a name for it. They can create food out of nothing.
Yeah, that's kind of the same thing. Jesus
multiplication of food.
Yeah,
which is another one of these so-called abilities. But they report one guy, Saint Bernard of Raeliano. This is so interesting. He was in his room alone and no one was watching him, but suddenly they thought there was a fire because this blazing light was coming from his room. They go running into it, and he's floating in the middle of the room, some 5 feet off the ground, emitting light, visible light, and some heat as well. In some cases, people hear like pounding noises or crackling, but they ran up to him, could not pull him down. Same with St. Joseph of Cupertino. They'd pull on him, yank on him, they could not budge him. Sometimes you just touch a person and they come down. And there's a good, I don't know if it's about 5% of the cases where people emit light. I started looking into this. I'm like, oh my gosh, because there are modern cases as well. There was Doretta Johnson, who was involved in a pretty heavy-duty haunting. Mm-hmm. And she had some really unusual things about her in terms of a very low galvanic skin response, or her brain waves were a little different. But she was seen emitting light from her body by her whole family. Like, oh my God, you're glowing, turn off the light. And I found a few pictures online of people who are like, has anyone heard of this? Look at this picture of me. You can see this aura around me. So I think what's going on here, because Yogi Narus, who I mentioned earlier, said levitation is simply a matter of vacating your body, an out-of-body experience, and the physical body is drawn up after it. So in essence, it's the aura or the astral energies or something, or taking that astral energy and getting a connection to your physical body to the point where they are integrated together in a way. But yeah, the whole emitting light is another really interesting and I think insightful aspect of this that might answer some of the questions of what's going on here.
How high have people been able to levitate?
Most are from 2 inches to about 5 inches, but there are some. Saint Padre Pio was seen going way the heck up there. I looked into Padre Pio. He's fairly recent. I think he died in 1970 something.
Yeah.
That man never left his church in Spain, but was seen all over the world administering to people, essentially by location. He only spoke Spanish, could understand anybody, and anybody could understand him. He brought someone back from the dead. He would make trees bloom. Some of this is, somewhat apocryphal. I don't know. But some is very well verified. And he was seen levitating on numerous occasions. One of my favorite is, oh gosh, I forget his name. It's Weor or something. Hey, well, don't quote me on it, but a really, really interesting case of this gentleman who was seen by pilots over, I think, the Tibetan area, way, like a mile up, right? And they're like, oh my God, there's this monk floating on a darn cloud. And he was seen over and over again by numerous pilots, to one like, I need to find out who this man is, and tracked him down to this monastery in Tibet. And, tried to get more information about it, but he was very tight-lipped. And said, what do you think I am, a bird? I'm not talking about this, essentially. But a really interesting case because they found out who he was. And he was seen by numerous pilots. And this was not that long ago. I don't think he's living now, but I believe it was 1800s.
No, really, it couldn't have been because these are planes, right? So it had to have been the 1900s.
Oh, well, yeah, you're right. Oh, okay, here it is. Yeah. Luong Pu Ween, born in 1887, died in 1985. In 1971, a Thai Air Force pilot saw him and tracked him down to, let us see, where did he live? Thailand. Near the Mapang Mountain in Thailand. And he said he was an ordained monk who specialized in Sayawet, or magical knowledge and practices. And he also was hired to chase away wild animals that were terrorizing villagers, and was well known for his amazing abilities. They called him thaumaturges, or wonder workers, throughout the Middle Ages. But that pilot came so close to this guy, he had to swerve to avoid a collision. And several thousand feet in the air, he said.
Oh my God. Well, I guess he didn't get a picture, but who knows if they're carrying cameras with them back then.
Yeah, no, but there is some good photographic evidence of this. There was an Italian guy, or a couple of them. Amadei Zuccarini was able, they photographed him in levitation. And there was another series of experiments done by, I think, another Italian guy. Gosh, hard to remember all these guys' names, but it was very well verified. They were doing seances where heavy furniture would get lifted and all this stuff. And they photographed, I can send you, this guy's, he's floating up right above the table. He would levitate. I'm telling you, the evidence of this is far more substantial than people believe or know about.
How does one attempt to do this? Or if everybody has this ability, can they do it? Is it too late to do it if you're later in life and, obviously not adolescent or a child?
No, it's never too late. St. Teresa of Avila was very casual about her religious beliefs until her midlife, 40s. And that's when she became very devout. And that's when this began to manifest. And the fact that it's apparent in every culture on this planet, I don't want to say every, but, all over the world, it's clear that this is something anybody can do. And again, different approaches to it depending on the culture. Prayer, meditation appears to be very effective in just spontaneously manifesting this. But in most cultures, it's connected to breathing. I think the clearest, instructive way to do this, because I go through all of this in the book, the different ways to approach this. In terms of yoga and achieving the city of levitation, all you have to do is meditate on the lightness of a feather. That's all you get. For superhuman strength, it's meditate on the strength of an elephant. So they're, very sparse on instruction, but apparently effective. But pranayama is this process where you breathe in for a certain timed amount, retain your breath for, I think it's half the amount of the breathing in, and then exhale at another rate. I think it's a ratio there. And they're like, don't do this without an experienced guide or teacher because it can be dangerous. But there's all kinds of this.
Why can it be dangerous?
I don't know. When I wrote the book, the publisher insisted on putting a disclaimer. Like, do this at your own risk. Like, okay, fine, whatever. I'm glad they published the book. But the people who said, if you're going to do pranayama, you should have a teacher. But at any rate, I did it for a little while. It's pretty hard to do because it is a very kind of difficult to hold your breath that long. You start at a certain level where you do for so many seconds and try to increase that to whatever it is. 20 seconds to breathe in, 10 seconds hold, 5 seconds exhale. Don't quote me on that, but that's in essence what you're doing. And you can, of course, take 1 second or 3 seconds to breathe in, hold for 1 second, and exhale for 2 until you get to that point of, I think it was like 30 seconds exhale or something. I don't know. It's in the book, but it's difficult to do. So there are some very specific methods on how to do this, and a number of them are related to breathing exercises.
Any final words for the audience?
Check out the book. It'll change your life, I promise you. It absolutely sent me on a pathway of spiritual exploration. And I mean, it blew my mind reading these cases. I had no idea. So don't believe me, look into it, and just recognize the fact that, yeah, we do have all these abilities of clairvoyance, astral projection, remote viewing, healing, taming wild animals, superhuman strength, multiplication of food, immunity to fire and cold. You've seen those monks who get up on a mountaintop in 0-degree weather and melt the snow all around them. It's all related to this. And this, according to several sources, is one of the easier psychic abilities to learn. Not sure that It's true because I haven't been able to do it. But then again, I haven't devoted the time it takes. Let's face it takes 7 years to become a doctor. You really, really have to devote a lot of time and energy and effort to it. And I'm convinced that if someone were to, go up into your room and for 7 years meditate, you could probably get this done. But the people who do it are not very vocal about it. So it's hard to say, but very well verified. So astonishing. And what cooler thing would there be than to be able to, raise yourself up off the ground? So, yeah. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. I love this subject. I could talk about it for a lot longer. There's so many cool cases. It is just amazing to me. And some have been viewed by thousands of people. I forget which guy it was. It's one of these famous St. Francis of Assisi or somebody, or levitated in front of 1,000 people. They all saw it. So yeah, I'm looking for more modern day levitators, but I'm sure there's people out there who can do it or are just kind of hush-hush about it.
Well, definitely for the audience, check out Preston's book. I will have a link below, or I do have a link below in the description. So thank you again, Preston. I'm glad I reached out to you on this because this is an absolutely fascinating topic. So thank you again for coming by and talking about levitation.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll send you some pictures. I'm telling you, it has been photographed.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. All right. Thank you again, my friend.
Of course.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They have a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.